In 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon, the men who guided him home were sitting inside a room that Philco built. The consoles, the communication systems, the beating electronic heart of mission control in Houston, all of it, Philco. Most Americans watching that moment on television had no idea. They were too busy watching history to notice the name on the equipment keeping their astronaut alive. That same name, Philco, had been the #1 radio brand in the United States for 24 consecutive years. Not 5 years, not a decade, 24 years. From 1930 to 1954, more radios sold in America carried that name than any other. Tens of millions of families built their evenings around a Philco, the wood cabinet cathedral radio sitting in the corner of the living room. The voice of FDR coming through it on a Sunday night, the World Series, the news from overseas. For a generation of Americans, Philco was not a brand. It was the sound of home. And then, without ceremony, without a final broadcast, without so much as a goodbye, it was gone. How does the company that helped put a man on the moon and built the American living room disappear without anyone noticing? That is the story of Philco. The story of Philco does not begin with a visionary in a garage. It does not begin with a single inventor and a single idea. It begins with 5 businessmen in Philadelphia in the spring of 1892, a rented building, and a product that was already dying before they finished making it. Thomas Spencer, Frank Marr, and 3 associates founded the Spencer Company with one purpose: to manufacture carbon arc lamps. These were the lights that lined city streets in the age before the incandescent bulb took over. Brilliant, harsh, expensive to maintain, and already being made obsolete by Thomas Edison's invention before the ink on the Spencer Company's charter was dry. Within a year, the company had nearly gone bankrupt. They renamed themselves the Helios Electric Company, purchased German patents for better lighting systems, and tried again. It did not help. By 1893, they shut down entirely. Most companies do not survive that. Philco did, not because of brilliance, but because of stubbornness. By 1899, the assets were sold, reorganized, and by 1904, the doors were open again. 2 years later, in 1906, the company reinvented itself completely. They became the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company, and they started making batteries for electric vehicles. It was unglamorous work, industrial, invisible, but it kept the lights on, and it taught the men inside that building something important: that the future was always in the next power source, not the last one. By 1919, the company had grown enough to need a proper name. They ran an internal contest. An engineer named Donald McGregor won it. The new name was Philco, short, clean, and unmistakably Philadelphia. It became the trademark first, the brand second, and eventually the identity of the entire company. But the man who would turn that name into a household word was not a founder. He was a quiet, publicity-shy engineer who had been with the company since the battery days. His name was James M. Skinner. History has not been generous to Skinner. His peers at RCA, David Sarnoff, the self-made titan who built the radio industry's dominant force, are in textbooks and halls of fame. Eugene McDonald at Zenith was known for his theatrical personality and his wars with RCA. Skinner avoided the press, gave no speeches, cultivated no legend. He simply worked. And what he built, while no one was watching him do it, was the largest radio company in America. In the mid-1920s, Skinner recognized something that the rest of the industry was slow to see. Americans wanted radios. They wanted them badly. But radios ran on batteries. Heavy, expensive, acid-leaking batteries that needed constant charging and made the whole experience more trouble than it was worth. The wife approval factor, as one period account described it, was essentially zero. The radio sat in the living room and leaked. Skinner understood that if radio was going to belong to everyone, it had to run on wall power. In 1925, Philco introduced the socket power battery eliminator, a rectifier unit that let users plug their radio directly into a standard light socket. Within 2 years, over 1 million of them had been sold. It was the right product at the right moment, and it made Philco's name known in every hardware store and radio shop in the country. Then almost immediately, the vacuum tube made the eliminator obsolete. Other companies might have retreated. Skinner moved faster. In 1928, Philco engineer Ralph D. Cannonberg developed a compact rectifier tube that allowed radios to be powered directly from household alternating current. No adapter, no eliminator, no batteries. The radio that could simply be plugged into the wall was now possible, and Philco, with its manufacturing infrastructure and its hard-won retail relationships, was positioned better than anyone to make it. The first Philco radios appeared in mid-1928. In the second half of that year alone, the company produced 96,000 units. 1 year earlier, they had not made a single radio. By 1929, they were in third place nationally. By 1930, they were first. The secret was not magic. It was Skinner's decision to apply automobile-style assembly line techniques to radio manufacturing, something no other radio maker had done. The result was a radio that cost less to build, sold for less, and reached families that no radio had reached before. Skinner's belief was straightforward and radical at the same time. A radio was not a luxury. It was not a piece of furniture for wealthy parlors. It was a piece of the world that every American family deserved access to, whether they lived in a brownstone in Manhattan or a farmhouse in Nebraska. That conviction, that technology should reach down into American life rather than sit above it, was the soul of Philco. And for the next 2 decades, it worked better than anyone could have imagined. In 1930, Philco sold 600,000 radios and grossed $34 million. It was the middle of the Great Depression. 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Banks were closing. Families were cutting everything they could. And yet, they were still buying Philco radios. That fact alone says something about what those radios meant, not as electronics, but as lifelines. The radio that defined that moment was the Model 20, known by everyone who owned one as the Baby Grand. It was a cathedral-style cabinet, arched top, ornate wooden grille, warm amber dial glowing in the dark. It looked like a small church organ sitting on a side table, and in many homes it served a similar purpose. It was the object the whole family gathered around. It was the thing you turned to when the world felt too large and too frightening to face alone. Over 2 million Baby Grands were sold between 1930 and 1938. In the decade when America had almost nothing, it had a Philco. The ritual of the Philco radio was specific, and it was real. In tens of millions of homes, the evening began the same way. Father turned the dial. The tubes warmed up. There was always that moment of silence before the sound came, a second or two of anticipation that became its own kind of pleasure. Then the voice came through. Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats reached the country through Philco speakers. Jack Benny, Amos and Andy, The Lone Ranger, the 1938 World Series. Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast that sent parts of the country into genuine panic. These were not radio programs. They were shared national experiences, and Philco was the instrument through which America experienced them together. By 1934, Philco held 34% of the entire domestic radio market. Their nearest competitor, RCM, sold 500,000 radios that year. Philco sold 1,250,000. The gap was not close. It was not a rivalry. It was dominance. And it was built not on advertising tricks or celebrity endorsements, but on a simple proposition that Skinner had insisted on from the beginning. Make it work, make it affordable, and make it last. Philco's engineers were not standing still during those years. In 1939, they introduced the Mystery Control, the world's first wireless remote tuning system. It used radio frequency waves to change stations and adjust volume from up to 25 feet away. Years before the television remote control was a concept anyone had thought to pursue commercially. Customers who brought one home described showing it to neighbors the way people decades later would describe showing off the first iPhone. There was genuine wonder in it. Here was a company at the peak of its power, and it was still reaching forward. Then came television. Philco had been experimenting with television technology since 1932 when it launched an experimental broadcast station, W3XE, from its Philadelphia headquarters. The man credited with inventing the fully electronic television system, Philo Farnsworth, worked at Philco from 1931 to 1933. The irony of that name, Philo at Philco, was not lost on anyone who knew the history. But what mattered was what Philco did with that knowledge. On November 11, 1947, Philco began mass production of the Model 48-1000, the first commercially manufactured television set available to American consumers at scale. It cost $395. In today's money, that is nearly $5,000, and people bought it anyway because what it offered was not a product. It was a window. The screen was 10 inches across, and the picture was black and white, and it flickered and required constant antenna adjustment. None of that mattered. What mattered was that the world was now visible inside your living room, and the box that made it visible said Philco on the front. By the early 1950s, Philco was producing 1 in every 3 televisions sold in the United States. The company that had led radio for 20 years was now leading television as well. Its Philadelphia factories employed thousands of workers who took genuine pride in what they were building. Supervisors remembered the factory floor as a place with a particular atmosphere. Competitive, skilled, loud with machinery and with conversation, and deeply loyal to the name on the front gate. In 1953, Philco's engineers developed the surface barrier transistor, one of the fastest switching transistors in the world at that time. It was a genuine breakthrough in semiconductor technology that would form the foundation of the company's push into computing. In 1955, Philco launched the Transic line of commercial computers, among the most powerful machines available for military and scientific use. The same company that had made the radio your grandmother listened to during the Depression was now building the computers that would help run the Cold War. And then in 1958, Philco introduced the Predicta television. It was unlike anything the industry had ever seen. A futuristic design with a swiveling picture tube that could rotate separately from the set's base. A space-age aesthetic that looked as though it had arrived from 20 years in the future. Industrial design publications celebrated it. Showroom floors moved it to the front window. It became a cultural object, a symbol of American confidence in technology and modernity, at the precise moment that confidence was at its highest. For anyone who walked into an American home in the mid-1950s and saw a Philco television in the living room, a Philco radio in the kitchen, and a Philco refrigerator humming in the corner, it would have been impossible to imagine that within a single decade, the company that made all of it would be gone. Not bankrupt, not destroyed by scandal, just gone, absorbed, dismantled quietly by decisions made in rooms far from Philadelphia, by people who understood the technology but had no memory of what the name had meant to the people who lived with it. That story was still ahead. In 1954, none of it was visible yet. Philco had just finished its 24th consecutive year as the #1 radio brand in America. 30 million radios, a nation full of living rooms built around a single name, and somewhere in a research lab in suburban Philadelphia, engineers were working on the next thing, always the next thing, with no idea that the forces gathering outside the building were larger than anything they had invented a solution for. There is a moment in the life of every great American company when success stops being a reward and starts being a trap. For Philco, that moment came sometime in the late 1940s, and it arrived wearing the disguise of opportunity. The logic was sound on its face. Philco had the factories. It had the engineers. It had the brand recognition that most companies spend decades trying to build. When consumers trusted the name Philco on a radio, it stood to reason they would trust it on a refrigerator. When they trusted it on a refrigerator, why not an air conditioner? When they trusted it on an air conditioner, why not a washing machine? The name was an asset. The question was how far an asset could be stretched before it became something else entirely. The expansion had actually begun modestly enough before the war. Philco introduced home air conditioners in 1938, refrigerators in 1939, and home freezers in 1946. These were reasonable adjacencies, the same manufacturing capabilities, the same retail channels, the same middle-class American consumer who already had a Philco radio on the kitchen counter. But after the war, the pace changed. Electric ranges came in 1949. Home laundry washers and dryers arrived in 1954. Each new product line required its own engineering team, its own supply chain, its own service network, its own advertising budget. Each one was a new business inside the business, and Philco was running all of them simultaneously while still trying to lead in radio and television and beginning in the mid-1950s, computing. The predicted television, introduced in 1958, captured both the brilliance and the beginning of the problem. It was visually extraordinary. The swiveling screen, the sleek lines, the look of something that belonged in a science fiction film rather than a suburban living room. Showrooms loved it. Design critics praised it. Consumers bought it. And then they called their dealers to complain. The Predicta ran hot. The picture tube, mounted in its separate housing, was vulnerable to reliability problems that more conventional designs did not have. Service calls came in, replacements went out. For a company whose reputation had been built on the word that Skinner had insisted on from the beginning, durability, the Predicta was a quiet but significant wound. Not fatal on its own, but the kind of wound that, in a body already under stress, takes longer to heal than it should. The stress was coming from outside the building as well as inside it. In the early 1950s, Japanese manufacturers began exporting transistor radios to the United States. Sony introduced its TR-55 in 1955, followed by the TR-63 in 1957, a pocket-sized transistor radio that sold for a fraction of what a comparable Philco model cost. These were not inferior products. They were smaller, lighter, more reliable, and cheaper. They targeted exactly the segment of the market that Philco had built its dominance on, the everyday American consumer who wanted something that worked and did not cost too much. Philco's response was to continue making larger, more feature-rich console radios for the premium market. It was a defensible strategy. It was also a retreat. At the same time, the company was pouring significant resources into its computer division. The Transac S2000, delivered in the late 1950s, was one of the most powerful computers in the world. Philco supplied machines to the National Security Agency, to scientific research institutions, to the military. The surface barrier transistor that powered these machines was a genuine engineering achievement. But the computer business operated on entirely different economics than consumer electronics. Sales cycles were long, contracts were large and infrequent, the margins were unpredictable, and IBM, with its vast sales force, its established relationships with corporate America, and its willingness to offer service contracts that made switching costs prohibitive, was consolidating the industry in a way that left very little room for a challenger, no matter how good the challenger's technology actually was. By the end of the 1950s, Philco was simultaneously competing in consumer radio, consumer television, home appliances, transistor technology, commercial computing, military electronics, and car radios. It had been supplying Ford Motor Company with automobile radios since the 1930s. It was a portfolio that would have strained a company twice its size. What it strained at Philco was the one thing that had held everything together through the Depression and the war and the television revolution: focus. James Skinner's original insight had been about clarity. Make the best radio. Make it affordable. Make it last. That clarity had built the company. But by 1958, Philco was no longer a radio company that also made televisions. It was a conglomerate in everything but name, making appliances and missiles components and transistors and refrigerators and computers, all under the same brand, all competing for the same pool of capital and engineering talent. The factory workers in Philadelphia were still proud of the name on the gate. The engineers in the research labs were still doing genuinely remarkable work. But the center of gravity had shifted, and no one at the top of the company had yet made the decision that the moment demanded. What is Philco and what is it not? That decision, when it finally came, would not be made by anyone inside the company at all. By the mid-1950s, Philco was not simply a company. It was a fixture of American life in the way that only a handful of brands in any generation ever managed to become. Not admired from a distance, not aspirational, present, constant, woven into the daily texture of how people lived, what they heard, what they watched, and what they believed the future would look like when it arrived. The numbers told part of the story. By 1954, Philco had sold more than 30 million radios over the course of 24 years as the industry's sales leader. 1 in 3 televisions in American homes carried its name. The Philadelphia factories that produced them employed thousands of workers, machinists, assembly line workers, engineers, salespeople, who had built careers and raised families on Philco wages. In towns across Pennsylvania, a job at Philco was not just employment, it was stability. It was the kind of work a man could describe with pride at a dinner table, the kind that came with the reasonable expectation that it would still be there 20 years later. But numbers do not capture what it meant to grow up with Philco in the house. For that, you have to go back to specific rooms, specific evenings, specific moments that people who lived through them still carry without quite realizing they are carrying them. Consider what it meant to be a family in America in 1948 and to bring home the Model 48 and 1000, that first mass-produced Philco television. The screen was 10 inches. The cabinet was larger than the screen, a heavy wooden box with a small glowing rectangle at its center. The picture flickered. The adjustment knobs required patience. None of that diminished the experience. Neighbors came over to watch. Children sat on the floor as close to the screen as their parents would allow. The programming was sparse and rough and magnificent in its novelty. Something had entered the American home that had never been there before. The visible world, delivered on demand. And the machine that delivered it said Philco. That cultural presence was not accidental. From 1948 to 1955, Philco sponsored one of the most significant television programs of the early medium, the Philco Television Playhouse, broadcast on NBC. This was not a variety show or a sporting event. It was a weekly anthology drama series that brought original, serious, adult television writing into American living rooms at the precise moment when the medium was deciding what it wanted to be. Patty Chayefsky wrote for it. Delbert Mann directed for it. It launched careers and set standards. When Chayefsky's Marty was adapted into a film in 1955 and won the Academy Award for Best Picture, the story had begun its life on the Philco Television Playhouse. The brand was not just selling televisions, it was funding American culture. For the employees who worked inside that brand at its peak, the feeling was one of genuine collective pride. Longtime workers at the Philadelphia facilities described an atmosphere that combined the discipline of a serious manufacturing operation with something harder to name. A sense that the work mattered, that the products were good, that the company stood for something real. Supervisors who had started on the assembly line and worked their way up remembered the particular sound of a fully running factory floor, the hum of machinery, the rhythm of the line, the conversations that happened in the spaces between tasks, the way a new model's introduction would move through the building like a current of energy. People cared. That is the thing that is hardest to replace once it is gone, and the thing that is easiest to destroy. The generational reach of Philco was perhaps its most remarkable quality. A grandmother who had listened to Roosevelt's fireside chats on a baby ground in 1933 might have watched the 1952 presidential election returns on a Philco television with her adult children, while a Philco refrigerator hummed in the kitchen where her grandchildren were eating dinner. 3 generations, 3 decades, one name, present at every major moment of American domestic life across the middle of the 20th century. That kind of longevity does not happen by accident. It happens because a company consistently delivers on its promise, and because the people who grow up with it pass the habit of trust on to the people who come after them. In 1958, the same year Philco introduced the spectacular and troubled Predicta television, the company also designed and began equipping what would become mission control for NASA's human spaceflight program. The consoles that would guide American astronauts through Project Mercury, Gemini, and ultimately Apollo were being built in Philadelphia. The company that had brought radio into the Depression-era farmhouse was now building the room from which humanity would reach the moon. The arc of it, from battery-powered cathedral radio to the nerve center of the space age, was extraordinary. No other American consumer brand had traveled that distance, but extraordinary arcs have apexes. And in the late 1950s, Philco had reached its highest point without fully understanding that the ground on the other side was steeper than anything it had climbed to get there. The competition it had always known RCA, Zenith, Magnavox, was being joined by something different, something faster, something that did not share Philco's history or its costs or its obligations, and that had no particular interest in the name on the factory gate in Philadelphia. What was coming would not arrive with a warning. It rarely does. The customers did not notice at first. That is almost always how it begins. The cracks appear on the inside of the wall, not the outside. The people living in the house go about their days. They turn on the television. They adjust the dial. They trust the name on the front the way they have always trusted it, because nothing has happened yet to tell them they should not. But inside Philco, by the late 1950s, the walls were showing strain in three separate places at once. Any one of them might have been manageable. Together, they were something else. The first was television. After the Second World War, RCA had moved faster than Philco into color television development. This was not a minor tactical difference. Color television was the single biggest consumer electronics opportunity of the 1950s, the transition that would define which companies led the next decade and which ones followed. Philco had the engineering capability. It had the manufacturing infrastructure. What it lacked was the singular focus that RCA brought to the problem. RCA's David Sarnoff had decided that color television was the future and had organized his entire company around making that future arrive on his terms. Philco was simultaneously managing appliances and computers and military contracts and its existing radio and black and white television business. The attention was divided. The investment was divided, and divided attention in a race with a focused competitor is almost always the losing position. By the mid-1950s, RCA had established itself as the leader in color television in a way that would prove very difficult to dislodge. Philco's color television sets came to market, and they were competent products. But competent was no longer enough. The window in which Philco could have seized the color television market, the way it had seized the radio market in 1930, closed, and it closed without Philco walking through it. The second crack came from a direction that the American electronics industry had not fully anticipated. And by the time most companies understood what was happening, it was too late to respond effectively. Japanese manufacturers, Sony first, then Panasonic, then a wave of others, entered the American market in the mid-1950s with transistor radios that were smaller, lighter, and cheaper than anything Philco was producing. The Sony TR-63, introduced in 1957, fit in a shirt pocket. It cost far less than a Philco table radio. It required no warm-up time. It did not need to sit on a side table and be adjusted with both hands. It was designed for a younger consumer who did not have a living room ritual built around a cathedral cabinet and an amber dial, and who did not particularly want one. Philco's response was to move up market, to focus on the premium console radio, the high-fidelity stereo system, the product with the hand-finished wooden cabinet and the powerful chassis. It was a logical response and, for a time, a profitable one, but it meant seeding the mass market. The everyday radio buyer, the person Skinner had spent his career trying to reach, was now buying Japanese. The foundation on which Philco's dominance had been built was being quietly removed, one transistor radio at a time, while the company looked the other way. The third crack was the most expensive. Philco's computer division, for all its genuine technological achievement, could not win against IBM. The Transact machines were real. The surface barrier transistor was a real innovation. The government contracts were real. But IBM had something Philco could not replicate quickly enough: a national sales and service organization that made corporate customers feel safe. Buying an IBM computer in 1958 came with the implicit promise that IBM would be there to support it, maintain it, upgrade it, and never leave the customer stranded. Buying a Philco computer meant buying better technology from a company that was also, simultaneously, trying to figure out what to do about Sony's pocket radio eating its lunch. The confidence was not there. The contracts dried up faster than they came in. How long could a brand carrying this much weight in this many directions hold itself together? The answer was already being written in the financial statements, though it would be some time before the full picture was visible. Profits that had seemed solid began to compress. Research budgets that fed 6 different divisions simultaneously produced breakthroughs that none of those divisions had enough capital to bring fully to market. Engineers who had joined Philco because it was the best place in the country to do serious electronics work began to look at what was happening in California, where a new kind of electronics company was being built. Leaner, more focused, unencumbered by appliance divisions and legacy manufacturing costs. The loyal customer in 1958 saw none of this. She saw a Philco television in her living room that worked well, a Philco refrigerator that had never given her trouble, and a Philco name in the newspaper announcing something exciting about space technology. She had no reason to doubt the future of a company that had been part of her family's life for as long as she could remember. That confidence, that reservoir of trust built over 25 years, was real. It was also, as it turned out, one of the last things Philco had left to spend. And somewhere in Detroit, in the executive offices of the Ford Motor Company, a conversation was already underway about a financially weakened electronics company in Philadelphia with remarkable technology, government relationships, and a brand name known in every American home. Ford was interested, not in the brand, in the technology. That distinction would make all the difference. On December 11, 1961, Ford Motor Company completed its purchase of Philco Corporation for approximately $100 million. The press release described it as an acquisition that would strengthen both companies, Ford gaining access to Philco's expertise in consumer electronics and advanced technology, Philco gaining the financial stability of one of the largest corporations in the world. It was the kind of announcement that sounds, on paper, like a rescue. What it was in practice was the beginning of the end. To understand why, you have to understand what Ford actually wanted. Ford had been buying Philco car radios since the 1930s. That relationship was comfortable and familiar. But the acquisition in 1961 was not about car radios. It was about transistors. It was about the surface barrier transistor, the Transact computers, the government contracts, the engineers who understood semiconductor technology at a level that almost no other company in the world could match. Ford wanted Philco's mine. The question that nobody asked loudly enough in December of 1961 was what Ford intended to do with Philco's soul. The answer came gradually and then all at once. In the early years of the acquisition, Philco Ford, the name Ford gave the combined entity in 1966, continued producing consumer electronics, televisions, refrigerators, stereo consoles. The stereosonic console of the mid-1960s was actually a genuinely impressive product, with powerful amplification and high-quality cabinet construction that reflected the craftsmanship Philco workers had always taken pride in. Console stereo systems reached what one account described as their zenith in 1966 and 1967. For a brief window, it was possible to believe that the acquisition had stabilized things, that Philco under Ford's ownership might find its footing and continue. But the direction of Ford's actual investment told a different story. The government contracts that had attracted Ford to Philco in the first place were expanding rapidly. Philco Ford was awarded the contract to design, build, equip, and staff the Mission Control Center in Houston, the nerve center of NASA's human spaceflight program. Philco engineers built the consoles. Philco technicians staffed the support roles. When John Glenn orbited the Earth in 1962, Philco equipment tracked him. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, the men guiding it home were sitting at consoles that Philco had built. The aerospace and defense work was real, significant, and consuming an ever larger share of the company's engineering talent and capital. What was not consuming that talent and capital was the consumer electronics business. And it showed. The first visible sign came in the factories. Workers who had spent careers building products they were proud of began noticing changes in the materials coming down the line. The solid wood cabinets that had been a point of pride in Philco's console stereos and television sets, real wood, carefully finished, built to last decades, were replaced with wood composite panels covered in vinyl paper and plastic trim pieces. The change was not announced. It was not explained. It simply happened, the way cost-cutting always happens in a large corporation. Quietly, incrementally, each individual decision defensible on its own terms, the cumulative effect invisible until it is too late to reverse. Then the manufacturing itself began to move. Ford made the decision to shift consumer electronics production to a Philco facility in Taiwan, Philco Taiwan, as it came to be called, where labor costs were a fraction of what they were in Philadelphia. The logic was straightforward from a financial standpoint. The consumer electronics market was becoming brutally price competitive, driven by the same Japanese manufacturers whose transistor radios had been undercutting Philco's mass market since the late 1950s. If Philco Ford was going to compete on price, it had to reduce its cost structure. Moving production overseas was the fastest way to do that. What moved to Taiwan was manufacturing. What stayed in Philadelphia were the people who had spent their working lives believing they were building something that mattered. The transition was not managed with the care that the workforce deserved. Men and women who had given 20 and 30 years to the company, who had started on the assembly line and worked their way into skilled positions, who had bought houses and sent children to college on Philco wages, found themselves on the wrong side of a decision made in Detroit by people who had never set foot on the factory floor. The language of the announcements was corporate and bloodless. The experience of receiving them was not. In 1971, Philco Ford shut down its transistor and semiconductor operations entirely, closing the Bluebell, Pennsylvania facility and laying off approximately 1,000 workers. The surface barrier transistor, the technology that had attracted Ford to Philco in the first place, the innovation that had powered some of the most advanced computers in the world, was quietly abandoned as specialized semiconductor firms like Fairchild and Texas Instruments consolidated the industry. Philco had arrived at the transistor revolution first. It left before the revolution was finished, pushed out by companies that had built their entire identity around the thing Philco had helped invent. Who exactly was supposed to protect the people who built all of this? The engineers who remained inside the company during these years described a particular kind of institutional despair. The feeling of watching something great being disassembled piece by piece, not in a single dramatic moment, but in 100 small decisions, each of which could be rationalized individually, and none of which could be stopped by any single person inside the building. The consumer electronics division was not a priority. That was clear. It was an obligation, a legacy business that Ford had inherited along with the technology it actually wanted, and that it was managing toward an exit rather than investing toward a future. By the early 1970s, the products bearing the Philco name were shadows of what they had been. The cabinets were cheaper. The components were foreign. The service network that Skinner had built in the 1930s. The Radio Manufacturers Service, that nationwide organization of trained dealers and technicians that had been one of Philco's greatest competitive advantages, was a memory. A consumer buying a Philco television set in 1972 was buying a name. The company that had earned that name over 40 years of genuine innovation was gone, replaced by a procurement operation managing offshore contracts on behalf of an automobile manufacturer that was losing interest in the arrangement. Ford began looking for a buyer. Negotiations with appliance maker White Consolidated Industries started in early 1974 and fell apart by March. By September of that year, Ford and GTE Sylvania, Philco's largest and oldest competitor, the very company that had manufactured Philco's own radio tubes decades earlier, announced the sale of Philco's non-automotive consumer business. The deal closed on December 11, 1974. 13 years to the day after Ford had bought Philco, it sold what was left of it to the company that had always wanted to bury it. The workers in Philadelphia did not need to read the financial pages to understand what that meant. They had already understood it for years. There was no single day when Philco died. That is one of the cruelest things about the way it ended. A bankruptcy has a date. A factory fire has a date. A founder's death has a date. What happened to Philco was slower and quieter, and in some ways harder to grieve, because it never gave the people who loved it a clear moment to say goodbye. It just kept diminishing, name by name, plant by plant, product by product, until one day the thing that remained bore so little resemblance to what had existed that the question of whether it was still alive was almost beside the point. The GTE Sylvania acquisition in December 1974 was the first transfer of ownership that made no pretense of continuity. Ford, whatever its failures as a steward of the Philco brand, had at least maintained the fiction that Philco was still Philco. GTE Sylvania had no such interest. GTE had purchased the Philco consumer business as a strategic acquisition. It wanted the market share, the retail relationships, and the remaining manufacturing assets. The Philco name was part of the package, not the point of it. Within the new corporate structure, the brand that had led American radio for 24 years was a line item. The consumer products that continued to carry the Philco name in the mid-1970s were increasingly difficult to distinguish from generic imports. The television sets were produced in Taiwan. The component stereos were assembled from parts sourced across Asia. The refrigerators and appliances, which had once been manufactured with the kind of care that made them last for decades, were now built to price points that reflected a market where durability had been replaced by disposability as the dominant consumer value. Longtime Philco customers who walked into an appliance store in 1975 and picked up a product with that familiar name on the front and turned it over to read the back did not always like what they found. Some of them put it down and walked out. Others bought it anyway, on the strength of a reputation that the product no longer deserved. The retail landscape was not helping. The department stores and appliance dealers that had been Philco's primary distribution channel for decades were under pressure from a new kind of competition. Discount retailers, electronics chains, and big box stores that operated on volume and low margin, that treated brand heritage as irrelevant and price as the only conversation worth having. In that environment, the premium that the Philco name had once commanded was eroding faster than anyone at GTE had a plan to address. In 1977, GTE sold Philco International, the portion of the business operating outside North America, to White Consolidated Industries, the same appliance company that had walked away from negotiations with Ford 3 years earlier. White Consolidated was eventually acquired by AB Electrolux in 1986, which is how the Philco International name ended up in the portfolio of a Swedish appliance conglomerate. The geography of that transaction captures something essential about what the brand had become, a name valuable enough to license in markets where its history gave it recognition, but not valuable enough to invest in anywhere it required actual commitment. In 1981, GTE sold the North American rights to the Philco name to Norelco, a subsidiary of the Dutch electronics company Philips. The transaction had a particular irony embedded in it that few people noticed at the time. Philips had been prevented for years from using its own name in the United States because of its similarity to the Philco trademark. Philips had been forced to sell its American products under the Norelco brand specifically to avoid confusion with Philco. By purchasing the Philco name, Philips was not acquiring a living business. It was acquiring the removal of an obstacle. The name that had meant something to 30 million American families was purchased, at least in part, as a legal solution to a trademark problem. In 1987, Norelco became a wholly owned subsidiary of Philips, and the Philco trademark in North America passed into the hands of a Dutch multinational that had no particular attachment to Philadelphia, to James Skinner, to the Baby Grand radio, to the predicted television, to the mission control consoles, or to any of the other things that name had once represented. The brand continued to appear on products in various markets, most significantly in Brazil and other parts of South America, where Philco International, under Electrolux ownership, maintained genuine market presence in manufacturing operations. In Brazil, the name survived with something closer to actual meaning. In the country where the name was born, it faded to near invisibility. The last Philco manufacturing facility with any direct connection to the original company's operations in the Philadelphia area, the Lansdale, Pennsylvania plant that had been part of Philco's production network since the post-war era, was torn down in September 1994. There was no ceremony, no commemoration, no gathering of former workers to mark the occasion. The building was demolished, the site cleared, and the physical last trace of what had been built in Philadelphia over a century disappeared without a public record of its passing. Consider what that plant had been. Consider what the people who worked there had made. Radio equipment that gave Depression-era families access to the world. Television sets that brought a nation together around shared experiences it had never had before. transistors that pushed the boundaries of what computing could do, consoles that guided human beings to the surface of the moon and brought them safely home. And then, one morning in September 1994, it was rubble. The workers who had been let go years before were not there to see it. Most of them had moved on to other industries, other companies, other lives built on the foundation that Philco wages had provided. Some of them had watched the whole unraveling from the outside, following the news of each ownership transfer the way you follow news about a place you once loved that has been sold to strangers. They understood, in the way that people who have actually made things always understand, that what was being lost was not recoverable. You cannot rebuild 24 years of market leadership. You cannot replicate the institutional knowledge of a workforce that spent decades perfecting its craft. You cannot manufacture trust in a brand that has been spent. What replaced Philco in the American living room was not one thing. It was Sony and Panasonic and Samsung, and eventually an entire ecosystem of electronics brands, most of them foreign-owned, all of them competing on price and feature sets in a market that no longer had room for the kind of loyalty that Philco had once inspired. The American consumer electronics industry that Philco had helped build, that it had for a quarter century actually led, passed almost entirely into foreign hands during the decade after the GTE sale. RCA, Philco's oldest rival, was sold to General Electric in 1986, and its brands subsequently licensed to Thomson of France. Zenith, the last major American-owned television manufacturer, was acquired by LG of South Korea in 1995. The industry did not just lose Philco, it lost itself. When the Lansdale plant came down in 1994, there was a Philco television somewhere in the back of almost every American appliance repair shop. Old sets brought in years ago, never claimed, waiting for parts that were no longer being made. The technicians who worked on them knew what they were looking at. They knew the difference between a chassis built to last and one built to a price point. They had seen that difference play out over 30 years of repair work, and they did not need anyone to explain to them what had happened to the company that used to build things the right way. That knowledge, held in the hands of people who worked with those products every day, was its own kind of memorial. Not the kind anyone built a monument to, but real and specific, and honest in the way that monuments rarely are. After the doors close, after the factories go silent, after the last ownership transfer is filed with the appropriate lawyers, and the name passes into the hands of people who never knew what it felt like to hold the original thing, what remains? In Philco's case, what remained was scattered and strange, and in some ways more interesting than the ending itself. The technology lived on in forms that most people who benefited from it never traced back to their origin. The surface barrier transistor that Philco engineers developed in 1953 contributed to the foundational architecture of modern semiconductor design. The engineers who left Philco during the slow dissolution of the 1960s and 1970s carried their knowledge into other companies, other labs, other projects, the way knowledge always moves when institutions fail to hold it, dispersing into the broader current of an industry and continuing to shape it long after the company that generated it has disappeared. That is a kind of survival. It is not the kind anyone celebrates at a reunion. The NASA work endured in the most visible way. The Mission Control Center that Philco designed and built for the human spaceflight program remained operational through Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and Skylab. The consoles that Philco engineers constructed guided 12 human beings to the surface of the moon and brought all of them home. That room, that work, those specific achievements belong permanently to the record of what American technology accomplished in the 20th century. The Philco name is not on any plaque in Houston. Most visitors to the Johnson Space Center who stand in the restored mission control and feel the weight of what happened there have no idea that the company that built the room also made the radio their grandmother listened to during the Depression. The connection is real. The recognition is absent. The brand name, meanwhile, followed the trajectory that brand names follow when they are separated from the companies that gave them meaning. In North America, Philips held the Philco trademark and used it sparingly, licensing it to manufacturers of low-end electronics that bore no relationship to the engineering standards the name had once represented. The products were unremarkable. The name was a ghost, recognizable to older consumers who remembered what it had been, meaningless to younger ones who encountered it on a shelf at a discount retailer and had no context for why it should matter. The more interesting survival happened in South America. In Brazil, Philco International, under Electrolux ownership, maintained genuine manufacturing operations and real market presence. Brazilian consumers bought Philco televisions and appliances in numbers that would have seemed remarkable to anyone who knew how completely the name had faded in the country that created it. The Philadelphia Storage Battery Company, founded by 5 men in a rented building in 1892, outlived its American identity by becoming a Brazilian household name. There is something in that displacement, something about the way American brands sometimes find second lives in markets where their history gives them credibility they can no longer earn at home, that says something uncomfortable about what had been lost in the original country. The collector community told its own story. Philco Baby Grand radios, those cathedral-shaped wooden sets that had defined the American living room in the 1930s, became objects of genuine desire among antique radio enthusiasts. A well-preserved Baby Grand in working condition sold at auction for several $100s. The Predicta television, that futuristic, swiveling design that had been both Philco's most celebrated aesthetic achievement and the beginning of its quality problems, became a serious collector's item. A piece of American industrial design history that appeared in museum exhibitions and design retrospectives. Objects that had been mass-produced consumer goods became artifacts. The things that Philco had made to be used were now being preserved to be remembered. The former employees did not have an artifact. They had something harder to hold on to, the memory of what it had felt like to be part of something that mattered. Workers who had spent careers at the Philadelphia facilities and been let go during the various contractions of the 1960s and 1970s described a particular kind of loss that had nothing to do with money or even with employment. It was the loss of a context. The factory had been a community. The work had been a source of identity. When it ended, what replaced it was not equivalent, and most of them knew it. The broader lesson of Philco's collapse was visible enough, though the American electronics industry proved notably unwilling to learn it in time. The companies that survived the transition from the post-war consumer electronics era to the digital age were, almost without exception, the ones that chose. They chose what they were. They chose what they would not be. Sony chose consumer electronics and pursued it with a focus that never wavered into appliances or computers in ways that compromised the core. IBM chose enterprise computing and let go of consumer hardware before consumer hardware destroyed it. Apple, in its second act, beginning in the late 1990s, chose simplicity in design and the intersection of technology and human experience, and held to that choice with a rigidity that often seemed excessive until it did not seem excessive at all. Philco had chosen everything. In choosing everything, it had gradually become nothing, or rather, it had become a name, which is the corporate equivalent of nothing when the thing the name once referred to no longer exists. A company is not its trademark. It is its people, its practices, its convictions about what it is trying to do and why. Strip those away through acquisition and cost cutting and the slow transfer of manufacturing to wherever labor is cheapest, and what remains is a label. Labels can be sold. They cannot be loved. What do we lose when a brand disappears and nothing takes its place? Not the products. Products get replaced, usually by something cheaper or faster or more capable. What gets lost is the particular relationship between a company and the community it served. The Philco worker who took pride in the quality of what came off the line. The consumer who trusted the name because experience had taught her the trust was warranted. The shared understanding, never written down anywhere, that this company and these customers had an agreement with each other about what the transaction meant. That agreement cannot be transferred in a corporate sale. It cannot be licensed. It ends when the company that made it ends, and nothing that comes after is quite the same thing. There is a house somewhere in Pennsylvania. There are thousands of them, really, but imagine one specific house on one specific street in one of those mid-century neighborhoods that grew up around the factories and the steady wages and the reasonable expectation that things would continue. In the living room of that house, sometime in the early 1950s, a family carried in a Philco television set. The father and a neighbor lifted it together. It was heavy, heavier than it looked, built from real materials by people who understood that the things you make for other people's homes ought to last. They set it against the wall. They ran the antenna wire. They turned it on and waited for the tubes to warm. That brief suspension before the picture arrived. And then the room was different than it had been before. Something had entered it that had not been there. The world was visible now, inside the house, on a screen that said Philco in small letters at the bottom of the cabinet. The children sat on the floor. The mother stood in the doorway. The father adjusted the rabbit ears with the careful patience of a man learning a new skill. Outside, it was an ordinary evening in an ordinary neighborhood. Inside, it was something close to a miracle. That moment happened millions of times, in millions of houses across every state in the country. It happened with radios before it happened with televisions. The baby Gran brought into the farmhouse. The dial turned for the first time, the sound of a human voice coming through the speaker from somewhere impossibly far away. It happened in apartments and bungalows and tract houses and rented rooms. It happened in places where the purchase required saving and sacrifice, in the kind of deliberate choice that people made when they believed that what they were buying was worth what it cost. And what it cost always was trust. Trust that the name on the front meant something. Trust that the people who made it had cared about making it well. Philco earned that trust over decades. It earned it through the Depression, when it made radios that working families could afford without making them feel that affordability required accepting something inferior. It earned it through the war, when it turned its factories over to the effort without complaint and came back to consumer production on the other side with the same standards intact. It earned it through the post-war years, when it brought television into the American home, not as a luxury but as something that belonged there, something that every family deserved access to, regardless of how much they earned or where they lived. James Skinner had understood something about the relationship between a company and the people it served that is not easily articulated in a business school case study. He understood that the transaction was never just commercial. It was a promise. And Philco, for most of its independent life, kept it. What that promise made possible is worth holding for a moment before letting it go. It made possible the particular texture of American domestic life in the mid-20th century. The evenings organized around broadcasts, the shared references that came from watching the same programs, the sense that technology was on your side, that the people making the things in your home were your countrymen, and that they had your interests somewhere in mind. That texture is gone now, replaced by something faster and more powerful, and incomparably more capable, and most of the time we do not notice the loss because what replaced it is genuinely extraordinary. But it is a loss. The relationship that existed between a company like Philco and the people who bought its products was specific to a time and a set of conditions that cannot be recreated, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to what it actually was. The workers who built those products deserve better than what they received at the end. The engineers who invented the transistor technology that Ford wanted badly enough to spend $100 million acquiring deserve to see that work honored rather than abandoned when it became inconvenient. The families in Philadelphia and Lansdale and across Pennsylvania who had organized their lives around the stability that Philco employment provided deserved a stewardship that took that stability seriously rather than treating it as a cost to be optimized away. These are not sentimental observations. They are factual ones. What happened to the people of Philco was a consequence of decisions, and decisions have authors. And the authors of those decisions made choices that other choices were available to them at the time. But this is not where the story ends. It ends in the houses. It ends with the baby grand radio that someone's grandmother kept on the shelf long after it stopped working because she could not bring herself to throw away something that had been so present in her life for so long. It ends with the Predicta television sitting in a museum case, its swiveling screen pointed at visitors who were not born when it was made, its futuristic lines still startling after 60 years, still carrying the evidence of what a group of engineers in Philadelphia once believed the future should look like. It ends with the collector in Ohio who found a Model 48 1000 in an estate sale, carried it home, restored it carefully over 3 weekends, plugged it in, and watched a picture form on the 10-inch screen. Faint, flickering, improbably alive, and felt something he could not quite name, something between pride and grief for a thing made well by people who are gone. Philco is a name now. It belongs to lawyers and licensing agreements and trademark registrations in multiple jurisdictions. The company that earned the name, the one that started with batteries and pivoted to radio and led the industry for 24 years and brought television into the American home and built the room from which humanity reached the moon. That company is gone. It did not go quietly or gracefully or in a way that honored what it had been. But it was real. The radios were real. The televisions were real. The work was real, and the people who did it were real, and the living rooms they furnished with their labor and their ingenuity were real, and the families who gathered in those rooms and trusted the name on the equipment were real. Somewhere tonight, in a house in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Kansas, there is a Philco Baby Grand on a shelf. The wood has darkened with age. The dial has yellowed. The fabric on the speaker grill has faded to a color that no longer has a name. But the cabinet still has its shape, that arched, church-like silhouette that millions of Americans once recognized on sight, that meant warmth and reliability and the sound of the world coming through a speaker on a winter evening. It does not play anymore. It does not need to. It has already said everything it had to say, and the people who put it on that shelf knew, when they put it there, that some things are worth keeping not because they still work, but because they are evidence. Evidence that something was made here, in this country, by people who cared, and that it was good.